Good evening, and welcome back to Vegas October 1 Sounds. It's been a few days. Tonight I'd like to share with you where I'm at in my research into the 8 volleys that, as reported in the FIT report, are 308 shots. Before you is my visual representation of the audio of about 40 seconds from a video, and this is in Sonic Visualizer. But before we get going with that, I'd like to give you a little bit of context as to what I'm showing you. If we look on the global time scale of everything, then with the first shots being up here on the left, we go volley 1, volley 2, volley 3, volley 4, and then we have these 6 shots that occur between volley 4 and volley 5, and then we go all the way on up to volley 12, and at the end we have 2 shots. So it's the 2 shots at the very end and the 6 shots between volleys 4 and 5 that I'm going to be addressing this evening. And these total of 8 shots are what are described in the FIT report as being 308 shots. Another way of looking at this is from the cyclic rate of, or the RPM, the rounds per minute fired. Same exact volleys, just expressed differently. In this case, it's expressed as rounds per minute, such that every single shot is plotted, and the shot rate is calculated and displayed here. Gives you a little bit better idea of, what kind of variance there is in each of the rounds. So the video I'm going to start with first is this one, and this is a patrolman camera. It's located on the boulevard near the corner of Mandalay Bay Road and Vegas Boulevard. This would be the southwest corner. And this particular video, which I'll just go over here now and briefly look at, this gives you an idea of where it's at. The video covers everything with the 6 shots, and then all the volleys, including down the hall shots, and then the last 2 gunshots. As we look at Vegas, there's several different types of gunshots involved. We have the first thing people normally encounter are the first 6 shots that start the whole sequence off, and then after that we get the what sounds like automatic gunfire coming in regular volleys. Those first 6 shots and most of the volleys are all characteristically about the same kind of sound, in that each round produces a supersonic crack and a muzzle blast. So there's 2 sounds per bullet, or per round of ammunition, and they're all very distinct, very clear. You can almost always see the both sounds produced by each round. Then we have another grouping of shots, and I'll just call this group 2, and that's where I put these 8 rounds. These 8 rounds also have a supersonic crack associated with them almost always, but the muzzle blast is not quite so loud, and I'll be going into the reasons why and whatnot later. The third group of sounds that we hear are down the hall shots. These particular group of sounds don't have a supersonic crack associated with them. All you hear is a very muted muzzle blast. And then we have a few random sounds situated throughout the venue. Sometimes you think they're gunshots, sometimes we think they're not. That's a whole different study. But anyway, and then the last 2 shots, which are very similar to those 6 rounds between volleys 4 and 5, but with a small distinction. So tonight I'm going to be covering the 6 shots between volleys 4 and 5, and the last 2 shots briefly at the end of all the others. Alright, so let's get back to Sonic Visualizer. By now everybody viewing this channel has probably listened to these things dozens of times, if not hundreds of times. But what very few of you have been experienced or witness to is how to look at these things from a visual standpoint. And that's what I want to bring up now, Sonic Visualizer, my go-to tool. So here I have from that one video, that's batch 13, number 120. I have 3 panels displaying the characteristics of those 40 seconds. On the top panel is what we call a power spectrogram, and it displays in a rough way the loudness of the sounds. The second panel in the middle is a log frequency spectrogram, which displays both the frequency on the axis going up and down, time this way, but the intensity of the sound somewhat by the color, with the brighter colors being louder. And then on the bottom we have what is called a spectral contrast spectrogram, and what it does is look from one moment to the next at how similar the frequencies were, and the more different they are, the brighter the color. So for example, up here in the log frequency spectrogram, we see this is just the people talking, screaming and all that. We see that they're kind of similar. So down here in the contrast, the spectral contrast, there won't be much brightness. But when a bullet comes along, which is completely different both in duration and frequency and intensity, you'll get a very bright line. And this is one easy way to visualize these sounds that aids the hearing process that everybody goes through in characterizing these gunshots. So let's bring back in some of the control panels on this stuff and eliminate. As you can see here, I've gone through and I've annotated this spectrogram up there to include some timings and the distance between each of the shots. And as you can see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's the main focus tonight, these 6 shots. And for those of you looking for answers straight up front, I'm going to try to give you the answers straight up front. And for those looking for the detail, after I give the straight up answers, I'm going to go into a fair amount of detail. What I'm not going to provide tonight is either the location of a shooter or the distance. What I'll be focusing on tonight, since this is midway through the investigation, for me anyway, is what I know so far and how it may relate to either both the fit report and what people think generally. And there's going to be a couple of surprises that people may or may not have already figured out. So with that, let's bring back in the left panel, which shows me the scales of the frequencies, and bring back in wheels for zooming, and bring back in the property paint. So now we start to look more like the rocket ship that I'm generally used to. If on this power spectrogram up there we eliminate the on this one too, we'll eliminate all the writing on them, and we shrink it down so once again we can see all of them. Let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6. Alright. Before we get too much further along here, I want to bring your attention to the dark region here. I'm used to what all this stuff tells me. Some of you may not be, but basically these loud areas over here, somebody screaming, at somebody. It's a male voice. And because it's so loud, the microphone system and the algorithms inside this cop cam have reduced the gain to accommodate the loudness of that hollering. And right here, if we'll bring this over to the center a little bit so I can examine it more closely, we'll see that once the hollering stops, the gain is again brought back up to where you can see the background noise, or what I call the background noises, which is the multitudes of people out there hollering, screaming, talking, and doing their thing. So before this person talks very loud, you'll see that background noise, and then you won't see much of it in between here, and then you'll see it again once the hollering is over. For us, we're going to be focused on these blips here, what each one of them looks like generally, and some timing matters. But before we get into the details, let me tell you what I found so far. All right. What I've found so far is that I've looked at numerous videos, extracted the audio from it, and run it through Sonic Visualizer, and come up with a few numbers, and I've also come up with a few characterizations of these sounds. So when we hear one of those gunshot sounds, it sounds like a snap, a crackle, a pop, a thud, or various sounds. And I've tried to categorize each one of those as something belonging to the supersonic crack. So it'll sound like a crack, a snap, or a pop, or there won't be one. And similarly, for the muzzle blasts, they typically sound like a big boom, or a thud, or a thump, or again, there won't be one. So each shot on a bunch of videos here, for example, I've categorized it. So for this video, which I call Under, which is a video that occurs on the front stage, near the front stage in the middle, on the first shot, I hear a snap, but no muzzle. On the second shot, I hear a P, which is a pop, but no muzzle. Again, a snap on the third one, a thud on the fourth, a crack with no muzzle on the fifth, and a snap followed by a thud on the sixth. And you notice that the seventh and eighth haven't received much attention yet. So I'm not going to be telling you too much about them, except to say that they are similar to these six, but they're lacking certain characteristics, meaning that there was some change in the environment or weapon that happened. So, as you can see here, I processed a number of videos, and this stuff doesn't represent all of the videos I processed, only where I'm at in the investigation currently. I'm about halfway through, another week or so, and I'll have everything pretty well laid out, and then it'll take a while to produce a final report. So with that said, let's go over some of the observations that I've made so far and the conclusions I've reached. The supersonic crack noise is the dominant sound that we hear for all the video recordings, and you can hear it everywhere practically. Sometimes it's not there, but generally it is. Let's see, I'll pull up. So it's kind of a noisy. This is the Las Vegas map, the shooting map, and over here is the east side of the venue, west side of the venue. Mandalay Bay is down here somewhere, and the red dots indicate, if you're not already familiar with it, recordings made by citizens. The yellow ones, cop cams. I've pulled videos from just about everywhere. And what I did in approaching this was I wanted to make sure that I had videos that cover the east-west direction, the northwest direction, north-south direction, and then everything out here all the way around, so that no matter where these sounds came from, I'd have a real good sampling, including the middle of the venue, to make observations from. And as you well know, I'm fond of many observations. What I found was that no matter where I was, the dominant sound was the supersonic crack. And herein lies the first distinction. The volleys, consisting of what we believe to be our 223 rounds, always have a very bright and clear supersonic crack sound with them, but they generally also have a very distinct muzzle sound. So for most of the 223 rounds, each round will produce two sounds, the supersonic crack and the muzzle, and you'll hear those two in a regular cadence. Now with these other rounds, let's just go ahead and call them 308 rounds for the moment. I'm not in my investigation enough to conclusively say they are 308 rounds, but let's just call them that for the moment. You'll find that the muzzle blast is nearly non-existent. Oh yeah, there's 5 or 6 or 7 places where it's audible, but by and large, the muzzle blast is not present. And that's a little bit of a mystery in that the general rule of thumb is that the bigger the bore, the bigger the boom. So 22 is, that the muzzle blast coming out of the end of the rifle is smaller than a 223, is smaller than a 308, is smaller or less loud than a 50 caliber. So we'd expect that if we're going up in bore, if we're going up from a 223 to a 308, that we would have a substantially larger muzzle blast, but we don't find that. Therefore, the muzzle blast must be attenuated in some fashion. Now I can tell you right up front that there's not a suppressor involved. That is, there's not a thing that you attach to the end of your rifle that suppresses the muzzle blast so much that at any distance it can't really be heard. Because we do, and I say that because we do have way out here in the Dan Valerian or whatever his name is tape. Let's see, maybe it lists it here. This is his right there. Yeah, Bilzerian, Dan Bilzerian. In that audio, which is, who knows where it is relative to the shooter at the moment, there are a couple of distinct muzzle blasts, but they're very attenuated compared to the supersonic crack. And similarly, over here on the boulevard, where the cop cams are, we do hear some muzzle blast, not as many as I would expect, and certainly not as loud as I would expect. So that tells me that there's something about the place or type of weapon that was used that attenuates or reduces the volume of the muzzle blast substantially. I don't know precisely yet exactly what that is because I haven't measured those intensities, and that's a fairly cumbersome and time-consuming process. But compared to the 223 rounds, which must have been, for the most part, hanging very much close to a window, if it's in the hotel, or in an open environment that if you have line of sight to, you can hear it. The muzzle blast for those is very present. So that's the first thing. Generally speaking, as you walk from south to north along the boulevard, both the supersonic crack and the muzzle blast that you can hear and the intensity of the sounds generally weaken, which would tend to indicate that the shooting location for these rounds is south of Mandalay Bay Road. Similarly, as you go from the west side to the east side, the same thing happens. both the supersonic crack and the very few but still existent on my visualizer screen muzzle sounds also get weaker. So once again, that's going to say that the source of the sounds is to the west of the venue. So now we have a situation where, based upon the intensity of the sounds of the supersonic cracks and the muzzles, few that there are, that the source of the sounds is both west and south of the venue. That's pretty much all I'm going to say on the source of the sound tonight. But what I'm going to go into are the things that I have discovered that are quite fascinating, even though I'm only halfway through this investigation. So let's get back over here. Expressed another way, the crack was heard everywhere. The muzzle was heard in very few places. These cracks, or the loudness of the cracks, increased the closer we got to Mandalay Bay, and the crack loudness decreases both as you walk north of the boulevard and the other direction east along Mandalay Bay Road. And as is expected, the brilliancy or uniqueness of all the sounds associated with these shots is more distinct when there's a quiet background, and then simply an artifact of the signal to noise ratio, because if you have a real quiet room you can hear a little bitty whisper, but when you have a room full of party goers you cannot hear a whisper. Okay? For the muzzle blasts that we have heard, they are generally heard in the quiet backgrounds or closer to Mandalay Bay. Now, the first big read I get from this, and this is just a statement of the conclusions of the observations I reach, is that shots 5 and 6 are nearly identical. That is, they have very similar sounds. I mean, very, very similar sounds, and all the numbers associated with them are very similar also. And they contain, and I've used both reflections, muzzle blast, and the supersonic cracks, and they come in perfect harmony, which means that for shots 5 and 6 they are almost identical paths. They only differ by a few feet. Now, that's the first time I've made such an absolute statement on pathing. So shots 5 and 6, whatever they did, they took an identical. They hit a target somewhere that was probably close. Two targets were very, very close to each other, or one big target. Shot 5, the measurements on it were slightly different, and let's see if the measurements are larger, then that means well, I'll get back to that. One of them is closer than the other, but they only differ by a couple of feet. That's the main revelation on shots 5 and 6. So we can definitively characterize shots in 5 and 6 as traveling the same path. Shot 4, we can definitively and conclusively say that shot 4 hit the fence, which was on very close to where, I'll just bring up the map, very close to where this recording is. Okay, so right here there's a gate, and it's actually recorded. Shot 4 hit this fence post, fragmented, caused those fragments hit the back of the cloth there and caused a bulge, and it's all recorded on the cop cams. A long time ago I did a 100-page analysis of that, and that analysis still holds, but it's buried somewhere in one of my document sets. So that's the second big takeaway here, is that we have 3 shots, 4, 5, and 6, all of which whose path now can be characterized, And shot 4 can be characterized further by saying it hit that fence. So 3 out of the 8 shots then are characterized in a way that's probably useful. If we compare that to the fit report, the fit report doesn't mention anything about shot 4 hitting. But it does say that shots 5 and 6 hit the tank. So given what I know now, that kind of makes sense, because the path to the tanks from wherever the shooting was had to be similar. And oh yeah, these are all coming from the same place. And I won't be able to, say exactly where or how accurate that statement is until the next part of the investigation is done and I've nailed down the distance to and the exact paths. I have a rough idea, but not an exact idea. All right. Now let's see. Oh yeah. One of the reasons that I know that bullet hit the fence is because the supersonic crack for that shot is not recorded on it's not recorded in many places on the east side of the venue. And what happens when a bullet hits something is it stops producing further supersonic cracks, and only the existing supersonic cracks propagate outwards, and if you're not in their path, then you don't hear them. And by looking at multiple locations, I can identify that the impact of the bullet is heard across a pretty good portion of the venue, and that bullet hitting the fence post caused what we call a ringing, and that ringing is also recorded in multiple places across the venue also. Okay. Okay. Based upon the nature of the supersonic loudness and the waveform and the intensity, I can say that this was a larger caliber bullet than a .223. I can't say exactly how much yet, but it is a larger caliber. And I already talked about the fact that the weapon did not employ a suppressive device. All right. So those are the big takeaways so far with my investigation. So let's go over and think about that a moment on conceptual things. So if the shooter was somewhere over here at the Mandalay Bay, then these would be the trajectories of the bullets. According to the fit report, bullets 5 and 6 hit the tanks. Based upon my numbers, the bullets 5 and 6 took very similar paths. So those two pieces of information corroborate one another. Shot 4, however, hit the fence up here, and you can see that there's a vast discrepancy between these two paths, and it's extremely unlikely that that's an accident. Let me rephrase that. The person doing the shooting was not aiming at the tanks for bullet 4. They were aiming at something else. I have no clue what, but given that it hit the fence, it was probably, something here on the corner. So let's take a look now at close detail. Let's see, the numbers here. So if we come down to this audio, it is 13:120, and we can see here from the chart that the first shot was a crack. We're going to talk about just the supersonic. The supersonic noise is crack, crack, and the crack is the most distinct, loudest, and high frequency crack. And then shot 4, it jumps down to a BD, which is a boom and a thud, no crack. and then the fifth and the sixth were both cracks, and the muzzles also sounded like supersonic cracks. But most importantly, these numbers right here are what I want to bring your attention to. These numbers, whether they measure a reflection or lag, are an indication of how close this person was to the trajectory of the bullet. And as you can see, they differ only by 5/1000ths of a second, which put into terms of feet, that's going to be somewhere between 5 and 8 feet difference, roughly speaking. Now that number doesn't tell you precisely how the orientation of those paths are. Namely, it could be it's somewhere in a circle or a sphere difference. So it's not like one is necessarily higher or lower, or east or west, or north or south. It just gives a distance, and you have to say it's in a region generally. And then we notice for volley, shot 4, that number indicates that the trajectory of the bullet was much closer to the observer, than 5 and 6. So if we go back over to here, I'll figure it out. Here, and we have the cop. We have to zoom in a little bit. He's right there about the gate. Then I would expect that the lag between the supersonic crack and the muzzle blast is bigger because the bullet is closer to him. Therefore, that number is larger, which it is, and that the lag for the shots 5 and 6, which were theoretically headed towards the tank, is smaller because they're further away, which it is, which they are. So far we're getting some pretty good agreement there. So what do the other shots look like there? Okay, so 4, 5, and 6 are covered. Shot 3, 1 and 3 have numbers which are similar to shots 5 and 6. And that's an indication that the path of those bullets was comparable to the path of bullets 5 and 6. I don't know whether they're further south or further north, because a missed distance of 0.213, it can mean it's either above or below. It's wherever the bullet goes, lag is symmetrical about the bullet path. So whether you're on the left side of the bullet or the right side of the bullet, you can still have 0.213 as a missed distance or a missed time. So I can't tell exactly yet, without looking at all these other numbers up here, exactly what the trajectory was. But what I can say is that the trajectories were similar. So this early in the stage, I'm going to claim or make an assertion that shots 1, 3, 5, and 6 were probably targeting the same thing, and that shots 2 and 4 were probably targeting something else. We know where 4 hit. Shot 2 is a little bit smaller, not too much, indicating that it was a little bit more distant from the cop cam than shot 4. So now I have to go back and I have to fill in all these numbers by measuring them, and then once I've got all those numbers done, I can start plugging and chugging, as they would say, and by when I'm done, I'll have a very exacting idea of where the shooter was and what the trajectory of each bullet was. But so far the big surprises have been is that this person was not aiming strictly at the tanks, but there were some other targets being there. With regards to bullets 7 and 8, I really don't have a lot of information yet, but they don't have the corresponding they have different reflections, let's say. If every sound comes along, not only has a direct path to the observer from wherever it's coming from, but there's also a secondary path that comes from the source of the sound, hits the ground, and bounces up, or hits a building and bounces over. So some bullets produce, oh golly, a dozen sounds because there's multiple reflections, and those reflections are in response to where the shooter is and how far the buildings that the sound is reflecting off of it are there. So I can pinpoint both the location of the recording and the nature of the source of the sound from those reflections, but it takes a while. It's a very cumbersome process and very time consuming. So when I finish filling in this chart, I'll be in good shape. So those are the big takeaways. Now let's get down into a little bit of the nitty-gritty, shall we say. And the nitty-gritty comes from this tool, Sonic Visualizer. As you can see in Sonic Visualizer, it's, it all looks strange and mystical, but it's not once you get used to it. Now this is a broad scale view. This is 40 seconds worth of audio viewed in 11 inches of screen here. But you can see how these shots, these marks here going up and down, which we call percussive things because they have a broad frequency spectrum. They go from high frequencies all the way to low frequencies, and they're very narrow. They're very narrow in duration. And that's what a gunshot looks like. Now, a lot of other things look like gunshots, but they don't have the same frequency structure. They don't have the same duration. The waveforms are different. Blah, 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 blah. But some are close enough to gunshots, that you have to take a very close look at. And sometimes there's even sounds which you can't tell whether they're gunshots or not because they're so soft or distant that it could have been a gunshot. And then you have to rely upon the context in which those sounds are made to determine what they might actually be. But for these, it's pretty clear. So if we take a zoom in look here, let's go over to shots 5 and 6, I guess. Let's just go right here. This is shot 2. I'm just going to continue to zoom in on it until I get, something where I can start to see the individual details. So, for shot 2, we see several things happening. We see 2 sounds, which are fairly strong, with the second sound actually being a little bit stronger than the first, and they're separated in time by about 24.6 milliseconds. And in terms of feet, just assuming that sound is traveling about 1100 feet per second, that's going to be about 30 feet difference. So that gives us an idea approximately. And then we see this sound over there, which is separated in time by 0.367. And then we see something else right here, which is separated by 0.206, which if we go back to our chart over here, and we drop down to this one, we see that for that one I'm recording at the moment a distance of 0.213. So, oh no, wait a minute, that was shot 1. Sorry, we're on shot 2, which is 0.367. Okay, so the sound that I'm measuring is approximately that. Then you can ask a very good question, which would be, why don't I measure that one and that one and that one and that one? And I have. Okay, but this sound, the first one and this one, are the sounds which are unique enough and similar enough to the other shots to make a good comparison. As to the exact nature and cause of these, I'll get to in a different presentation because, well, just because they require a lot of information. So there's a shot 2, and you can say, okay, fine and dandy. What about shot 1. Now shot 1 was back this way a ways. It would seem amongst all this talking, this screaming actually. Okay, and there you see it. There and there. The two sounds again. This first one with a reflection. In this case, the reflection is a bad term. The second sound is not as loud. And then over here we see something that's happening that is 1.31 seconds. So given how supersonic cracks and muzzle works, there's something. This is not a, either. This is not either. This second sound is not either one. It's a reflection of something at a distance that's well over 1,000 feet. Okay, so we can see here that shot 1 and shot 2 are different in nature, which, as we talked about earlier, I believe that shot 1 was headed in the same direction as shot 5 and 6, and shot 2 was headed in a different direction. And that different direction is closer to the recording officer in this case, so the sounds are stronger. Yeah, and you say, yeah, the lights go on. As the sounds get closer to the camera, they become more distinct and more information is carried, and that's true. Alright, so let's go to shot 3. What does it look like? Now we have to move to the right some here. And, if I want to see what I've actually already written, it says 9.95 seconds to the next one. And here we are, shot 3. Which, just for convenience sakes, I've already annotated this as the distance between two sounds here is 0.231. Now this sound could very well be a muzzle blast. I haven't done enough analysis on it to say concretely. It could also be a reflection. But the big deal is that it has this pattern. And this pattern we'll see again. Let's go, this is shot 3, which I believe was 1, 3, 5, and 6 were all headed in the same direction. So if I scrunch down here, and I hop on over, this is to shots 5 and 6, they should look the same because they're headed along a similar path. Okay, and in fact, as you can see, right there, there's 2 marks. Those are the major sounds. And it looks very similar to that. And we'll see that this one's a little bit different. This is shot 6 in that it still has the 2 sounds with about a 0.2 something difference between them. Hello. Let's see. Somewhere about a 0.23 something or other between them. But there's potentially other little sounds creeping in at various places. And that it doesn't have as much of that double peak as say shot 2 did. Okay, and then you can see some other noises in the background there. This long thing is a siren, and these other noises in the background are people talking. And if you come down here to the spectral contrast, this is confirmation of what you're seeing up in there. So here you see there was a big difference in the nature of the frequency of the sound there, and there, which wasn't so visible up there. But there it is, 1, 2, and 3. So we should look for that in the shots which were also going in the same direction or taking the same path. And here you can see that actually there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, many more reflections in that case. And those reflections will tell me something about both where the recording was taking place and the nature of the bullet that went by and the nature of the source of the sound. Alright, so now 1, 3, 5, and 6 are all very similar. So let's go to 4, which I said hit the fence. There's 4. You notice it doesn't have a big prominent sound over there. It has a little bitty one, which if we look down here, you see this sharp line. But more importantly, if we take a close-up look at this thing, we'll actually see that several things are going on. The most important being that this group of sounds right here, when viewed at it on a waveform basis, I guess let's change that to a red, and we'll expand it out so we can see the waveform of it. Both. That's not a very good color. How about white? Yeah. How about purple? Nah. Now let's turn off this over here, and so we can just see it by itself. And you can see the flexibility of this program. All right. The thing to observe here is all these oscillations that occur, and they don't occur separated by distance. They are just blah 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 blah. They go on and on and on, and this is what we call a ringing, and it's a metal ringing because the frequency is pretty high. If we were to, and that little waveform pattern right there is how I know conclusively that this was an object of fairly high frequency, like a post. And these sounds over here are related to the gun. That's a supersonic crack, and that's probably an immediate reflection from the ground. Okay, and one of these peaks over here may in fact be some remnant of a muzzle blast, like that peak right there. I'll have to go into more research and detail later to see it, but that ringing sound there. So we got a ringing sound produced immediately after the supersonic crack, and since the supersonic crack had a 0.4, like what was it, 0.4? 0.429, that indicates that the bullet for this case was very close, within 30 feet, roughly. And that the post-oscillating occurred in a very close time frame. How close? It occurred within 37 milliseconds when we hear the supersonic crack. So obviously if the bullet hit the post, then the supersonic crack that we hear had to come from the post, and obviously the ringing of the post had to come from the post. So why the difference? Well, as it turns out, the supersonic crack didn't come from exactly the post. It came a little bit further, closer to the Mandalay Bay, and that's why we hear it. Well, the timing can get interesting. Let's just put it that way. So this is ringing. That's the supersonic crack. That's probably a ground reflection. We also have the cop cam video, and the timing on it is fairly causal in nature also. So that's 4. So that only leaves 2. What did 2 look like? Now let's shrink it back up here and re-enable that thing. There we go. Re-enable my text label so I don't get lost. 2, there we go. Two is more similar to 1, 3, and 5, except that the distance between these peaks here was closer to 0.367. So it didn't hit a fence post. It didn't hit the fence post, and it was further or closer to the cop than 1, 3, 5, and 6. Okay. So there's a host of other things we can tell from these visualizations of the sound, But the research is ongoing, and I'll be able to give you more concrete answers in terms of, like I said, of the shooter's location, the elevation and the distance. And with all these reflections in here, I should be able to nail it down much, much closer than 100 feet, given enough time. But that's where I'm at in this investigation with these shots. So, if the shooter was shooting at two different things, why? I don't know. I don't think the audio will ever tell me that, but these are interesting questions that it brings up. But we can conclusively say that there were shots probably headed in the direction of the tanks. And there were two shots, just like the FIT report said, that hit the tanks. I've yet to go over and examine carefully the audio of the recordings that were closest to the tanks. They should also have recorded the ringing that occurs when the bullet struck those tanks. And that'll be confirmation that the paths of the bullets correspond to what the FIT report said. Now, this is kind of both supporting the FIT report and not fitting the FIT report. The FIT report says that all 8 shots occurred between volleys 4 and 5. They do not. Only 6 shots, volleys, yeah. It's only 6 shots occurred. And the other 2 were at the end. And as I've already mentioned, all of these must have, the muzzle blast must have been attenuated, so that may jive with what the FIT report says, namely that it was inside a room. But I'm still looking at that. Okay, well, that's enough of this whole thing. I hope this shows where I'm at, how the analysis is done, adds a couple of surprises, and adds maybe a couple of disappointments. Anyway, that's it for this evening, and we'll grab you in the next one.